Earlier on in the week, I uploaded a video about Vampire Survivors, which I'll link at the end of this one if you haven't seen it. It's quite long, and it is using Vampire Survivors to talk about a particular type of game design theory and how you can apply it to understand games better and perhaps to understand games you're making. So check that out later if you find this video interesting, but this is going to be a lot shorter and snappier. I'm going to be applying what I've learned about Vampire Survivors and what makes it work to 3 similar games that have been sent me. So Vampire Survivors is a game which looks quite simple on the surface, and it's no surprise now that it's become its own subgenre of action games that people want to emulate and experiment with. But what features actually combine to make the secret sauce of Vampire Survivors? And that's what I'm going to take you through now. We've got Space Survivors by Majestic 17, sort of very visually pleasing top-down space shooter. 9 Lives Ninja Survive by JX Games, because who doesn't want to be a ninja cat that rolls around and gets gems? I do. And Cosmic Blastards by Team 5 Steps, in which you play a foul-mouthed Russian guy who looks a bit like Mr. T. And as always, there'll be links below in the video description if you want to check any of these games out for yourself, or if you want to add them to your wish lists. There are a few things about each of these games that I'd say are kind of easy areas for improvement. In 9 Lives Ninja, I'd like to see a bit more attention given to how it feels to beat the enemies. It's not very satisfying, there isn't much in the way of sound and visual effects, and it holds it back compared to Vampire Survivors, where killing enemies feels like popping bubble wrap. In Space Survivors, the camera's a little bit too zoomed in, which makes it hard to navigate, so I keep speeding into danger without being able to see it coming, and that doesn't feel great. I think often in games we see cameras that are just way too close, and I think sometimes it's because the dev has spent all this time on making art and they want to show it at a particular resolution rather than thinking about the impact on the gameplay and how much stuff the player can see at any one time to kind of make their decisions. And Cosmic Blastards also has a couple of issues with cameras. It makes the game a bit too easy to get lost in, not that that matters much, but also it glitches out a bit when the right stick that you use to aim is left in the central dead zone. Putting all of that aside, there are 2 general principles from Vampire Survivors which I think all 3 of these games need to try and understand and learn from in some way. The first one comes back to what I said about enemies popping like bubble wrap. Fighting in Vampire Survivors is inherently satisfying because enemies feel good to kill, and you do it so frequently because the difficulty in Vampire Survivors isn't immediately deadly. The game gives you a good chunk of time at the start to just enjoy popping things. When the difficulty eventually increases and the threat of death becomes harder to avoid, you actually want to stay alive because being alive lets you do the fun thing of popping enemies. In the 3 games I played, this wasn't really the case. The initial difficulty was always way too high, and that meant my attention was focused entirely on avoiding death. Now, some of you might say, let the developers do what they want, this is a different game, it doesn't have to copy Vampire Survivors exactly, but that would be missing the point. This isn't a complaint just about difficulty, it's a complaint about the starting difficulty. When death comes too quickly, it often feels like the game isn't giving me enough reason to value being alive in the first place. So despite its name, Vampire Survivors isn't a game that's just about surviving. In the early game, and at various points throughout, it's also a game about easily popping opponents that are much weaker than you and farming them for power. The game does such a good job of making that part enjoyable, and that means that when you do eventually die, it matters because you really wanted to keep playing. Your player is not going to fear or respect death in a game which hasn't given them enough opportunity to get attached to their own progress or just to the satisfying feeling of interacting with the game world. So maybe there's a broader game design lesson here for anyone making action games, and specifically games where the player is in peril. Avoiding death isn't a good enough driver in its own right. There needs to be something to lose, and having collection and progression which feel inherently satisfying is a good way to make players care about losing everything that they've done so far. So to come back to our 3 games and to the bubble wrap principle, I would say that Cosmic Blastards does best on the game feel side of things. These enemies are really satisfying to squish, even if the game is just much too hard to start off with. Space Survivor comes a close second. It's a bit gentler in terms of not trying to kill you so quickly, but the camera is still a bit too close. And I'd like to be popping enemies a bit more regularly and for more perceived reward. Maybe more XP crystals floating around to pick up, but with each of those being worth a little bit less. And this brings us onto the second aspect of Vampire Survivors, which is largely missing in these games. Experience points in games are usually not represented as a physical object to be dropped on the ground and picked up, and that's because the experience is, well, it's experience, it belongs to a character, it's intangible. But whether your game characters are dropping XP crystals or gold coins or chunks of space scrap, whatever the resource is themed at, the point is that those pickups laying on the ground can help lead to different player behaviors and more interesting moment-to-moment decisions. In Vampire Survivors, the XP gems dropping on the floor mean that the battlefield is in a constantly evolving state with areas of high danger and areas of high reward. This is why the game can feel so compelling despite the fact that all you're doing is moving the character around. You're not just moving out of harm's way, you're also making lots of split-second decisions about whether to focus entirely on avoiding danger or whether to take risks. At the most abstract level, playing Vampire Survivors is like reading two overlapping heat maps with a colour representing danger and another representing reward. The player has to constantly survey the screen and work out which point has the best risk-reward ratio. And that feeling of having very little to do but walk around, but a high amount of information to interpret, that comes partly from the XP gems dropping on the floor and staying there, but also from the plethora of very easily identifiable enemies which all have different amounts of health and different movement speeds. It doesn't take many plays to get a sense of which enemies do what, and that places them higher or lower on the player's mental model for threat detection. That kind of red version of the heat map, I guess. At the moment, Space Survivors is the only one of these games to really use the gems on the floor element of Vampire Survivors to give players more to think about and react to, and even then, I'd probably like to see more of those sparklies thrown in. 9 Lives Ninja does have XP pickups, but they come to you automatically, which means that the heat map I just spoke about just doesn't exist. It doesn't have that reward layer to think about as you're playing. It's worth thinking about what pickups are for generally in games and what they do in specific genres. Some games use them to encourage exploration of a level, but in this genre, they encourage you to move around in particular ways, use the space in a particular way, and give you more split-second decisions about how to engage with the enemy. Without them, 9 Lives Ninja and Cosmic Bastards quickly become games which are entirely about avoiding death, and again, that kind of plays into this feeling of not really caring as much. If your game is just about avoiding death for as long as possible, there's not much space for players to feel good about surviving. Picking stuff up provides another level of juicy bubble wrap feeling, but it also gives players something to make judgments about on top of and alongside the decisions they're making based on incoming threats. Of the 3 games we just looked at, Space Survivor is the only one which really makes good use of this. And even then, it's quite hard to fly around and collect the crystals because they're relatively rare, and again, it's hard to navigate because the camera is too close and there are no landmarks. So, whether you're working on a game in this genre or an action game in general, or you're just a big old design nerd like I am, I hope you found this useful and found some concepts you can apply elsewhere. When you're making a game in a popular genre, it's really important to be able to look at the standard features there and understand what they're doing, what they achieve for the game. Most of the time, players need more than just the threat of death to keep them playing. Rather, death is a tool that you use to add tension and to turn continued play into its own reward. Give players something to do which feels inherently satisfying, and then they'll care a lot more when you slowly and gently introduce the threat of that loss. I hope this video has helped you understand how even a relatively simple seeming game can be quite complex in terms of the dynamics which make it fun. It's not always a case of having more or less features, more how the elements that you've chosen to add to the game work together dynamically to give the players competing objectives like try not to die and try to get as much stuff as quickly as possible. If you want to hear more about this, like I said, you can check out my previous video on Vampire Survivors, which will be linked in a minute, where I explain the MDA theory of game design, talk a little bit about the concept of flow, and how specific design decisions lead to games feeling a particular way. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insights into game design and how to make an indie game which people want to play again and again and again and again and again and again. And again.